If you haven't been living under a rock, then you certainly must have heard people use this expression which goes,
If you can believe that, then I have a bridge to sell you.
If you believe that, I have got a bridge to sell you.
This expression is often used sarcastically to suggest that someone is gullible or easily fooled. The origin of this famous expression is largely credited to the activities of a notorious Irish-American conman, George C. Parker, who became infamous and made a living for himself by selling the Brooklyn Bridge. Yes, the Brooklyn Bridge. One might be tempted to ask, how could this be possible? Well, join me as I take a deep dive into the intriguing life of one of the most legendary fraudsters and conmen that ever lived. George C. Parker was born one of 8 children to Irish parents in New York on March 16, 1860, about 1 year before the commencement of the American Civil War. As one could imagine, growing up in that post-Civil War era was as tough as it could be, especially since sickness and starvation were the norm. His family lived in a dilapidated shack, and life during the post-war era of Reconstruction was a constant struggle as his father strived to put food on the table by doing multiple odd jobs. Food was often scarce, and many nights, George went to bed with a gnawing hunger in his belly. His mother did her best to stretch the little they had, cooking what meager portions of cornmeal or beans they could afford. From an early age, it was obvious that the odds were stacked against him. Nevertheless, George had a couple of positives on his side. He was good-looking, confident, had a charming personality, and was very smart. These features endeared him to friends and strangers alike and made him seem very knowledgeable and trustworthy. As George grew into his late teens, he became quite desperate to escape the poverty that had plagued him all his life. He hadn't meant to turn to crime. It wasn't something he had planned or even considered as a young boy growing up, but desperation has a way of bending the moral compass. He took to the streets, and from that point on, George found himself slipping further down a path he hadn't intended to take. He observed that the streets were full of opportunities for someone who was willing to blur the lines between right and wrong. So he began to engage in petty theft and other small crimes to fend for himself. Despite his escapades in the street at a young age, he was largely able to evade brushes with the law. George's adulthood was marked by the drastic transformation of New York City. The city's economic activity was booming, and it was fast becoming the capital of finance, trade, communications, and popular culture. Massive construction projects erupted all over the place, and numerous high-rise buildings sprang up at a feverish pace. With this sustained economic growth and rapid development came a surge in immigration. These migrants came not only from other parts of the country, but also from other foreign countries, most especially Northern Europe, as thousands fled the rising political instability and economic hardship plaguing the region. Every day, the port stations were crowded with wide-eyed newcomers, immigrants and artisans seeking a fresh start. They arrived with hopes of a better life. But George knew from experience that the streets weren't kind to the unprepared. He had spent years observing the way the city chewed up the vulnerable and spat them out. And now, he saw an opportunity. George had never been content with small-time crime. The petty thefts, the pickpocketing, the fake gems, these were the games of his youth. They kept food on the table and provided a thrill, but they were no longer worth the risk. He had learned the hard way that the bigger the con, the bigger the reward. And what he needed now was a final play, one big enough to retire on, one that would allow him to leave the streets behind for good. He had his eyes on the perfect mark, the new migrants. They arrived daily, often with little more than the clothes on their backs and a few savings tucked away. They were eager, naive, and desperate to make their way in a city that didn't care if they succeeded or failed. George's sharp eye caught their fear and uncertainty. He saw how they gravitated toward anyone who offered them even a bit of hope, and he knew exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. George devised a plan which was simple in its brilliance, but it would require finesse, patience, and the right accomplices. George had spent years cultivating relationships with men who, like him, walked the line between legitimacy and crime. He knew forgers, street hustlers, and other conmen who could play the roles he needed. Together, they would orchestrate a scheme to swindle new arrivals out of their savings, all under the guise of offering them the very thing they sought: a new start. The first move of his master plan was to identify a landmark property. The Brooklyn Bridge at that time was one of the most massive concrete and steel structures. Opened on May 24, 1883, its unique hybrid suspension design was one of a kind and bore testament to the ingenuity of its designer, John Roebling. The Brooklyn Bridge was the first fixed crossing of the East River. The imposing structure was a sight to behold for the thousands of immigrants who were arriving New York City daily through the Immigration Center in Ellis Island, which was located about 6 miles away. These migrants were understandably amazed by the monstrous structure, as most had seen nothing with such an intriguing design. He was counting on the visibility of the Brooklyn Bridge from the Ellis Island and its one-of-a-kind features as some sort of self-advertisements for the migrants undergoing documentation on the island. Next, George recruited and bribed some of the ferry drivers responsible for transporting the migrants from the Immigration Center on the island into the city, and tasked them with scouting for potential targets. Whenever these ferry drivers identified any wealthy-looking immigrant, they engaged them in stories about the American dream.
Well, welcome to America, amigo.
The drivers spoke in great details about the massive real estate market in New York and how there were numerous opportunities from the real estate boom which could be of benefit to the immigrant. Eager to get a slice of the American dream, these prospective victims would indicate their interest in this latest venture and would be subsequently referred to George.
I am interested.
On meeting with the newly arrived immigrant, George presented a convincing pitch and provided a stack of counterfeit documents verifying him as the owner of the Brooklyn Bridge. The victim, with little or no understanding of the American system, was led to believe that the government had just passed a new law that allowed willing investors to become partial or full owners of the bridge. George further explained that once the ownership was secured, these investors could go ahead to erect their own toll booths on the bridge and could keep a percentage of the income earned from taxing the public for the use of the bridge. After presenting this irresistible proposal, George escorted the victim to the Brooklyn Bridge. On arrival at the bridge, the victim would spot a small signboard with the words, "Bridge for sale," mounted conspicuously at the entrance of the bridge. The victim also observed that there were other prospective buyers who were being shown the bridge at the same time. Unknown to them, the signboard had been mounted by one of George's accomplices prior to their arrival, and the other so-called prospective buyers and sellers at the bridge were merely cons hired by George to play those roles. Also, George looked the part. He was handsome, well-dressed, looked wealthy, and sounded quite knowledgeable. To the victim, everything seemed to check out. There was absolutely no need to second-guess this offer. Moreover, he made it very clear that the offer was available on a first-come, first-served basis. He insisted that there was a lot of interest from other potential buyers, and he couldn't guarantee how long the offer was going to last. George was able to sweet-talk his way into the victim's pockets. He sold the bridge to his victims for $75 upwards, which is over $2,600 when adjusted for inflation in the present day. And later on, he would even claim to have sold it for as much as $50,000, which is over $1.7 million today. Now an owner of the Brooklyn Bridge, his victims would attempt to erect a toll booth at the bridge entrance, only to be stopped by the police with an eventual realization that they had been scammed. This scheme would prove quite successful for George, such that it was claimed that he sold the bridge twice a week for many years. Following his success with the bridge scam, he expanded his illegal activities and replicated the same strategy in the sale of other prominent structures and buildings like the Statue of Liberty, the old Madison Square Garden, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and even the tomb of the 18th President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant. He was able to conduct these scams and other similar scams over many years by adopting fake names, which included James O'Brien, Warden Kennedy, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Taylor, William McCloundy, and so on. Despite his numerous successes in scamming people, he was not invisible to the law, as he was arrested and convicted of fraud on 3 different occasions. He was even able to avoid conviction and incarceration on one occasion following his arrest in 1908, after he escaped the courthouse by disguising himself as a sheriff. However, the law finally caught up with him in 1928 when, in an ironic twist, it was a simple counterfeit check that led to his downfall. George issued the fraudulent check to an unsuspecting victim, confident that his expertise in forgery would protect him. but the check was quickly traced and George was arrested once more. This time, the stakes were higher. George was brought before Judge Alonzo G. McLaughlin, a tough, no-nonsense man known for enforcing New York's Baum's laws. These laws mandated a life sentence for anyone convicted of a fourth felony, leaving George's fate sealed. Despite all his smooth-talking and attempts to manipulate the court, there was no escaping this time. George, now older and less spry than in his younger days, was sentenced to life imprisonment at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Sing Sing was a notorious prison filled with hardened criminals and some of the most dangerous men in the state. However, George, with his silver tongue and charm, didn't fade into obscurity behind bars. Instead, he became something of a folk hero among the inmates and even the guards. His stories of daring heists, brilliant cons, and narrow escapes fascinated everyone who heard them. Guards would sometimes linger near his cell, listening to his tales of how he once walked out of a courthouse in a sheriff's uniform or how he duped wealthy businessmen with fake land deeds. He would rapidly rise to the status of a legend as his story would spread like wildfire within the confines of the prison. To some inmates, he was an inspiration, a symbol of defiance against a system that seemed impossible to beat. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a man who had flown too close to the sun. Unfortunately, George succumbed to an illness and died in 1937 at the age of 76, having only served 8 years of his life sentence. At the peak of his fraud with the Brooklyn Bridge, George seemed to have inspired other copycat conmen such as Reed C. Waddle and the Gondorf brothers to perpetrate the same scheme as they took a leaf from his playbook to defraud unsuspecting immigrants. The bridge selling scam became so prevalent that eventually the employees at Ellis Island Immigration Center started handing out posters to the new arrivals, warning them against buying public buildings or streets. Also, police officers had to increase their patrol on the bridge to discourage the illegal transactions. The Brooklyn Bridge scam eventually lost steam after the 1920s, as more people became aware of it, and more arrests were made on the perpetrators. Looking back today, the idea of buying the Brooklyn Bridge seems laughable, so ridiculous that it has become part of American folklore, a symbol of gullibility and misplaced trust. However, it's crucial to remember that the world was vastly different then. In an era without the internet, without fast communication, and with only limited access to reliable news, the ability to verify such information was almost non-existent for most immigrants. People arriving in America were often isolated, unfamiliar with the language, and desperate to succeed in a new world. To them, the scam wasn't absurd. It was an opportunity, one they didn't want to pass up. And while we may laugh at the idea today, we must acknowledge that scams evolve just as technology does. The tricks that duped people over a century ago may seem simplistic now, but in their time, they were incredibly effective. Similarly, many of the scams people fall for today, phishing attacks, Ponzi schemes, identity theft, might seem laughable in 30 years, especially as cyber technology becomes more sophisticated and safeguards improve. What hasn't changed, however, is the fundamental human desire to believe in opportunity and shortcuts to success. Whether it's a bridge in the 1890s or a too-good-to-be-true online deal in the 21st century, con men like George have always known how to exploit that hope. It's a lesson that transcends time. When it comes to deception, the tools may change, but the principles of the con remain remarkably the same. Thanks for watching. You can share your thoughts regarding this piece of history in the comments section below. Please remember to show your appreciation by hitting both the like and subscribe button. Also, don't forget to share this video. Thank you.